So our topic for today is game theory and the prisoner's dilemma. Important both in providing a sort of independent perspective on some of the issues in Hobbes that we talked about last time, and for their own sake. It might seem odd initially that in the chapter on the social contract theory, where he begins with Hobbes and the Leviathan written in 1651, Rachels then goes on to introduce the tools of game theory, which is a branch of what mathematical economics developed 300 years later. But there's nothing idiosyncratic about that. So basically all the major Hobbes scholars sort of since the development of these tools of game theory have in some way used them. I mean, if you look at the most important philosophers who've worked on Hobbes in recent years, David Gautier, Gregory Havka, Gene Hampton, they all in different ways use game theoretic ideas. It's one of those cases where, despite the historical gulf between Hobbes on the one hand and game theory on the other, there's nonetheless a sort of natural intellectual fit. Right? Okay, begin then with the concept of a game. This is a concept more general than that of the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is one specific, familiar, important, instructive game, but there are lots of others. I want to make that point abstractly. Now we'll make it rather more concretely in a while by just introducing you briefly to some other games. But here then is a version of a game theorist definition of a game. This is it's a technical concept in a sense that we've encountered earlier, in that it means something slightly different than it does in ordinary language, though lots of what in ordinary language we call games are also games in the game theorist sense. So here's a definition. All right, the prisoner's dilemma is the game on which we'll focus most. It's so called because of the story standardly used to introduce it. I should say also that, somewhat annoyingly for our purposes, it's not really a dilemma in the sense that we earlier defined. Nonetheless, we'll continue to refer to it as the prisoner's dilemma because that's what everybody calls it. So here's the story. You are to imagine that you are a inhabitant of a place with a partially but not wholly corrupt judicial system. And for the purposes of thinking about this, it's just a sort of background constraint that what you're aiming to do is to do as well as you can for yourself, in particular, as we'll see in a bit, to avoid as much jail time as you can. So though you've done nothing wrong, one night you're picked up and taken to jail and put in a cell. And a while later, the DA comes into the cell to meet with you. And it's a further sort of just background constraint on this, that you are to trust what the DA says. Okay, there's no issue about whether he's telling the truth or not. He is. Right? So here's what he tells you. He says, I'm under pressure to solve a, fairly serious crime. I know you didn't do it, but, I've got to put someone away for it. Right? Here's the thing. Given the, partially corrupt character of the system, I can't convict you of this, I can't convict anyone of it, without some confession evidence. Right? So, I'm going to make it in your interest to confess to this crime. So I've got someone else, same situation, in a cell the other side of the jail, right? And deal is, if you sign this bit of paper confessing to the crime and implicating this person on the other side of the jail, then I'm going to put that person away for 10 years for the crime, right? And I'll let you go free. Now, I should tell you, I'm offering that other person the same deal. Right? If you both confess, then, I'm going to convict both of you of the crime, but since you've both cooperated, I'm going to mitigate the sentence some, so you'll each get only 5 years. Now, I shall be upset if neither of you works with me and signs this thing. Then, unfortunately, absent any confession, I can't put anyone away for this major crime that I'm interested in convicting someone for. I can, however, get you put away for a more minor offence, so that's an offence for which you'll serve a year in jail. Okay, so you're to trust what the DA says, and what you're interested in is minimizing the amount of time you spend in jail. So the question is, what should you do? Confess or not confess? And why? So what's the rational choice here, and why is it rational? Yes?
The rational choice? Sorry.
The rational choice would be to do what's beneficial to you, so that would be to confess, because you don't know what the other prisoner is going to do. You have no way of communicating with them.
Correct.
So the best outcome can only come from you confessing for you.
So let me articulate the reasoning you used there then. So you say the rational choice is to confess, and as I understand it, but correct me if I'm wrong, your argument that it's rational to confess is, if you confess, you have some chance of the best outcome, namely no time in jail.
Yes.
Okay. Well, so, that's good, and it's a good start. You're right about what the rational choice is. You're wrong about what the best argument is. Okay. So the argument that it's the rational choice is not merely that this choice gives you some chance of the best outcome. Does anyone else want to articulate it? Yes.
I think that it's the rational choice because, according to Hobbes, you're supposed to do what's in your own best interest.
Right. So we grant that. I mean, it's sort of a background condition here, background assumption. You're trying to do what's in your own best interest. To say that confessing is the rational choice, sort of to say that confessing is in your own best interest. But then we want to know, okay, so why is confessing in your own best interest? And we had one candidate suggestion, right? The candidate suggestion was, it's in your own best interest because it gives you some chance of the best outcome, which is no jail time at all. And I said that actually that's not the argument you want here. Yes?
Confessing will minimize your time regardless. Either the other person confesses, you get 5 years. If you confess and he doesn't, you're off the hook. And ultimately, you can't assume that he's not going to confess. So it's in your best interest to confess as well. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so you sound like you're on the right track there, right? So look, the right argument for confessing is this. You don't know what the other person's going to do, but whatever the other person does, you're better off to confess. If the other person doesn't confess, you're better off to confess. If the other person does confess, you're better off to confess. So whatever the other person does, you're better off to confess, so you should confess. I'll go over that again and sort of with numerical detail in just a tick. But I want to be clear about the way in which it's a different argument from the plausible one that you raised. And there's another sort of analog one you could do, right? So, I mean, look, there are some situations of choice under, less than full information where the best you could do to justify a certain choice would be, well, it gives me some chance of the best outcome in the way that you suggested, right? Another principle of choice that you might appeal to in such situations would be one that said, well, you've got to choose the option that gives you no chance of the worst outcome, right? Again, there are choice situations in which that would be the best you can do, right? A first key point about the prisoner's dilemma is this is not one of those situations. This is not one of those situations where the best you can do by way of a principle to justify a certain choice is to say it gives you some chance of the best or no chance of the worst. There's a much more powerful argument for the rationality of confessing than that one. It's this argument that goes systematically through the possibilities and says whatever the other person does, you're better off to confess. Right? To rehearse that argument, it helps to employ a kind of standard graphical representation of the prisoner's dilemma, games in general, and the choices available to you, right? So let's see. So I've got one of these. If we can pop over to the PowerPoint, and I'll say a little bit about how it works before going through it. I'll use my pointer here, right? So the deal is, right, well, you've got your person one over here, right? And you've got, so those are person one's options. It's come out a little funny on the PowerPoint. You can see that's confess, that's not confess. Person two's options, confess, not confess. And then the way the diagram works is the sets of numbers. So the left-hand number, that's the outcome for person one. The right-hand number in the ordered pair, that's the outcome for person two. Okay. Then the thing you put in the box at any point is the outcome generated by the two choices that intersect at that point. So what, this 5-5 is the outcome generated by person one confessing and person two confessing. Does everyone understand how the diagram works? Yeah? Okay. So I'll give you a bit more of a sec to write it down, and I'll go over that argument for why confessing is rational. All right, so let's go over the argument. So look, why is it rational to confess? It goes like this. Suppose I'm person 1. I don't know what person 2 will do, but I know that person 2 will either confess or not confess. Suppose person 2 confesses. If I confess, I get 5. Don't confess, I get 10. So I should confess. Suppose person 2 doesn't confess. If I confess, I get 0. I don't confess, I get 1. So I should confess. So whatever person 2 does, I should confess. So I should confess. Similarly for person 2. Don't know what person 1's going to do, but I do know that person 1 will either confess or not confess. Suppose person 1 confesses. If I confess, I get 5. Don't confess, I get 10. So I should confess. Person 1 doesn't confess. If I confess, I get 0. Don't confess, I get 1. So I should confess. So whatever person 1 does, I should confess. So I should confess. Right? So that's sort of, if you want to define a prisoner's dilemma, right, there are a couple of ways to do it. One is to produce an appropriate diagram of the sort we just did, right? Another is to give a kind of verbal definition. Yeah. So the first part of the verbal definition is the first of the sort of 2 key aspects to see is prisoner's dilemma is a situation where it's clear what it's rational for each individual to do. Right? There's this sort of very powerful argument that just one of the options is the rational choice. But then if we look back at the diagram, we can then sort of bring out the other thing, right? So look, prisoner's dilemma, it's clear what is rational for each person to do. And if we each do the rational thing, we end up here, right? But look, we're both worse off there than we are here. That's what makes it sort of problematic, not strictly speaking a dilemma, but problematic, right? So, I guess we could, yeah. So sort of to add the second bit of the verbal definition in, right? So a prisoner's dilemma is a situation where it's clear what it's rational for each individual to do, and where if each person acts rationally, they'll all be worse off than they all would have been had each acted irrationally. So I do that again? So it's a situation where it's clear what's rational for each individual to do, and where if each person acts rationally, they'll all be worse off than they all would have been had each acted irrationally.
So would irrational be not to confess?
Yeah. In this case, right? Clearly worse for you. That's the first part of the argument. So that's the prisoner's dilemma. Important and interesting game, and we'll come back to why, both sort of for general reasons and for reasons specifically related to understanding Hobbes. Before we do that, though, I want to bring out more, fairly quickly, the way in which the prisoner's dilemma is sort of only one game, right? And there are, a whole bunch of others, right? And I want to do that, make that lesson somewhat more vivid or concrete or something, just by briefly introducing you to they're broadly members of sort of the same family of other distinct games, right? So let's see. So here's one. If we go to the PowerPoint. Now, so you're to imagine this game being played in a psychology lab. You and one other person, you can't communicate, right? You've got 2 arbitrarily labeled outcomes, heads and tails. That may not be the best arbitrary labeling, actually. We might be better to give them color names, like instead of heads and tails, blue and red, right? Because I suppose it may help if, maybe heads has a certain priority or something if it's heads and tails, whereas blue and red don't. Right? But in any case, you're, in this psychology experiment, right? And what you're told is, you've just got to arbitrarily pick one of these things, and the person on the other side of the lab's just got to arbitrarily pick one, and the payoffs for you depend on what you both pick, right? I mean, if you both pick the same thing, you each get $2. If you pick something different, then you don't get anything, right? So what should you do? You can't communicate with the other person. Anything you can do? What's that? I mean, the idea is no, right? I mean, a situation like this, I mean, if you knew the other person would pick one of them, heads or blue or whatever, then of course you'd pick that one. And the same for them, right? I mean, if they knew what you were going to pick, then they'd pick that one as well. But, absent communication, absent any sort of salient marking of one option as opposed to the other, right? I mean, there's no good way to solve it, no good way to know what to do. Change it a bit, and it's easy, right? So change the outcomes here. I mean, now what should you choose? You should choose tails, right? I mean, you can be pretty confident about that, right? Because, I mean, you know that the other person's going to think choose tails because we'll both be better off if we choose tails, so you can be confident on that basis that the other person's going to choose tails and the other person can think the same about you, right? No need to be able to communicate, you can figure it out. I mean, do like one more variant, right? So, yeah, if we switch back to the PowerPoint, here you see, right, we've added sort of an element of conflict of interest as well as the shared interest that we had in the first two versions, right? There are a couple of things you could think about this. One is you could think there's an obvious solution, right? If you can talk to each other, right? The obvious solution is whichever one you pick, whoever gets paid the $3 then pays off, pays the other person 50 cents, and then you're both good. There's another line of thought that gets developed by people thinking about this stuff with respect, in part to games like this one, which is a line of thought about how in certain sorts of bargaining situations it can be to your advantage to be and to be known to be stubborn and unreasonable, right? I mean, that is, if you're the person who is known to be stubborn and unreasonable and just insists on the outcome where you get the 3, right, and not prepared to share, then sort of by being so known to be stubborn and unreasonable, you put the other person in a position where they can either go along with that and let you get the bigger share, or they get nothing, right? And, then sort of if they're rational, then they, it can seem like what they should do is, just accept that they get less, right? So the stubborn, unreasonable person, by being stubborn and unreasonable, gets more. All right, so look, I mean, the point about those games is not that we're going to do anything much more with respect to them. It's just, as I indicated at the start of introducing them, just to kind of make a little more concrete the message that the prisoner's dilemma is a very important, interesting game, but it's not the only game. There are lots of others. All right, turn now then to the importance of the prisoner's dilemma. First, we'll talk about its sort of importance in social theory in general, and then we'll turn to its role in understanding what's going on in Hobbes. So, the thing to see about the importance of the prisoner's dilemma in general is the way in which the structure of incentives in a prisoner's dilemma contrasts with the structure of incentives in a well-functioning market. So look, there's a line of argument that has a long history in economics. It goes back at least as far as Adam Smith, and gets carefully and fully mathematically worked out in the early 20th century. A line of argument to the effect that, under the right conditions, and economists are very clear that you have to meet these, and if you don't, the argument doesn't work right. But under the right conditions, a well-functioning market will be such that if everyone pursues their own interests, then in a specific, well-defined sense, they'll all be better off, right? And that's, I want to say the standard, certainly, at least a standard, but really I would say the standard argument for sort of the goodness of market arrangements. Right? Under the right conditions, market arrangements are such that if everyone pursues their own interests, they'll all be better off. Right? But then you see, right, how a prisoner's dilemma situation contrasts in a very clear way with that sort of well-functioning market situation, right? Because look, in a prisoner's dilemma, what we have is that if everyone pursues their own interest, they'll all be worse off. So that means it matters a lot when you're looking at things like, is there an argument for some sort of government intervention with a certain institution, or should it be left alone? How the structure of incentives works there. I mean, if it works the way things do in a well-functioning market, that's some argument for leaving it alone. By contrast, if the incentives structure works the way it does in a prisoner's dilemma, then that's an argument for intervention. Right? Now, that's all pretty abstract. So I could see someone thinking, well, it's all very well, but, the prisoner's dilemma is just this funny story about this, hypothetical world, and I don't see that there are really any prisoner's dilemmas, in real life. But when you sort of know how to look, I think it's easy to see that there are, right? The real life ones are typically multi-person, right? They typically involve not two participants as we have in the, the easy initial version of the story, but more than that. But they nonetheless have that basic prisoner's dilemma incentive structure, right? Let me do one worked example for you. This is, I got this originally from a report. It was quite a long time ago. I don't know, it was 10 or 15 years ago or something. A report done by the NewsHour's economics correspondent, a guy called Paul Solman, about the decline of the Massachusetts fishing industry. Right? And the idea was, to explain the decline of the Massachusetts fishing industry, and his basic explanation was that the structure of incentives there was a prisoner's dilemma. Right? And what that, suppose there were, just pick a number, right? Suppose there were sort of 50 active fishing operations, fishing boats, whatever. What they'd done is they'd overfished. And so they were all very badly off. None of them could anymore pursue their livelihood. Why had that come about? And his answer is, well, it's a prisoner's dilemma. Yeah. And it's easy enough to once you know what you're looking for, to sort of fill that in and see how it would work, right? I mean, in effect, if you're one of these fishermen, right, in various forms, you consistently face the question, shall I catch that extra fish, right? Shall I go out one more time? Shall I put my nets down one more time, etc. Right? And there are benefits and costs from doing that, right? Benefit is you get the extra fish, right? The cost is those fish aren't around to breed for new fish for next year, right? The problem is the benefits of you catching that extra fish all accrue to you, right? By contrast, the costs of your catching that extra fish, namely that it's not around to, you know, spawn and reproduce and make new fish for next year, they're sort of shared equally with all the other fishermen, right? Because, I mean, there's no reason to suppose that you're any more likely to catch the offspring of the fish you don't catch this year than anyone else is, right? So even if sort of the social cost of your putting your nets in one more time is very high, because that cost is shared equally with everyone, when you just look at it from your own perspective, the benefit always outweighs the cost. So all these fishermen, right, go around and they all just keep catching that extra fish, going out one more time, etc., right? And you end up with no fish left, right? You see how that's, you know, that's an explanation of a sort of real-world economic phenomenon as a prisoner's dilemma. Yeah? I mean, it's a situation where it's clear what it's rational for each of them individually to do. It's to catch as many fish as possible, and if they all do that, they're all worse off because there are now no fish for them to catch. Yeah? As I say, I think once you've gone through one worked example like that, right? I mean, it's easy to sort of carry on from there and see how plausibly there are lots of others, right? Because you know, I mean, you need evidence, right? I mean, you know, it would be possible to sort of portray something as a prisoner's dilemma, and it turned out it wasn't, right? I mean, it's possible. Just as it would be possible to sort of portray something as a well-functioning market, and it turned out it wasn't. Right? But I mean, you can see how, right, in the fishing industry case, if that's an accurate description, they would really all have been better off if the government or someone had been able to come in and say, okay, here's your quota. You can only catch this many, and we're going to enforce it, right? Because sure, I mean, they'd make a little less this year, but they'd still have a, you know, they'd still have a fishing operation in 3 years' time in a way that they didn't. Right? Okay, so that's sort of the importance of the prisoner's dilemma in general. Right? Turn now finally to its importance in understanding Hobbes. Right? As I said at the beginning, I mean, lots and lots of Hobbes scholars in different ways like the idea that Hobbes' arguments are well understood in terms of the tools of game theory. And the simplest way to do this is to think that Hobbes' argument that the state of nature is a state of war involves, in effect, representing the state of nature as a prisoner's dilemma. Right? I want to say in the end, for reasons that we've already sort of previewed, that that's too simple, but you know, it's a decent start, right? So if you're going to do that, here's a way it might turn out. So this, I mean, here what we've got, right, is two sort of possible ways of behaving cooperatively or egoistically, right? Now, like in our coordination games, unlike in our original prisoner's dilemma, the numbers here are positive. They're units of life or happiness or something, so the more the better, rather than units of years in jail, so the more the worse. Right? And the idea, right, is that you're going to end up with, you know, rational behavior is going to lead you to this situation where everyone's substantially worse off than they would be in this one. Put a slightly different way, right? It'll be a situation where if everyone's rational, they all end up acting egoistically, but then they're all much worse off than they all would have been if they'd all acted cooperatively. So, I mean, I want to endorse very much the general idea of understanding Hobbes's arguments by employing the tools of game theory. But I want to suggest that this very simplest version, according to which Hobbes's argument that the state of nature is a state of war involves representing the state of nature as a prisoner's dilemma, is, I mean, it's too simple, right? Here's why, right? This comes back to our reading of the Hobbes extract last time, right? If you picture Hobbes's argument that a state of nature is a state of war as representing the state of nature as a prisoner's dilemma, then what you're thinking is what causes conflict in the state of nature is sort of rational responses to a badly structured situation. But we saw last time that that's, as it were, only a part of Hobbes's account of the causes of quarrel or conflict in the state of nature. In particular, when we looked at those motives, we saw that the motive he had under the heading competition really did fit with that picture, right? And that was true of sort of the first half of what he said about motives under the heading of diffidence or fear, right? Both those cases, it really did look like conflict caused by rational responses to a bad situation. But then we saw that there was a different element introduced by the latter half of what he said under the heading diffidence and then what he said under the heading glory, right? Because there what he introduced was causes of conflict that involved, by his lights, irrational motivation, right? Causes of conflict involving, first, some people who just like fighting so much that they pursue it even when it doesn't contribute to their security. And second, people with a concern for their reputation, which again seems to be a concern for their reputation, not just to the extent that it contributes to their security, but sort of for its own sake, right? To the extent then, right, that in Hobbes the, causes of quarrel or conflict are a matter of irrational motivation, then picturing the argument as simply the state of nature is a prisoner's dilemma doesn't capture all of it, right? All right, good. So that's a convenient place to break. We can take a longish